The fMRI scans from Kent Keel's lab at the Mind Research Network have mapped the brains of over 3,000 violent offenders, and in every single one, there's a signature pattern in the prefrontal cortex. It's not trauma, it's not abuse, it's something the family structure wired in long before any crime was committed. You've heard the story 1,000 times. The killer had a rough childhood, abusive father, absent mother. The blueprint for violence is written in the bruises, except the data from the Dunedin longitudinal study, 32 years, 1,037 children, tells a different story entirely. Only about 36 to 42% of serial killers experienced documented physical abuse. That means the majority did not, which leaves a massive, uncomfortable gap between what we assume and what the scans actually reveal. Here's what the fMRI reveals when you look at the family structure of a predator. It's not about what was done to them, it's about what was missing, the consistency of reward, the predictability of consequence, the threshold at which the impulse cycle is trained to fire or to pause. Think about the home environment where every emotional transaction is negotiation, where affection is conditional on performance, where discipline swings between neglect and explosion. That's not abuse in the classic sense. No broken bones, no visible scars. But the developing brain reads inconsistency as a threat signal. The amygdala learns that safety is unreliable. And the prefrontal cortex, the brake on impulse, never develops the wiring to slow the cycle. This is where the scan breaks the narrative. You can see it in the functional connectivity. The pathways between the orbitofrontal cortex and the amygdala are thin, underdeveloped. Not because of trauma, but because they were never trained. The family structure didn't provide the repetitive, predictable feedback loop that builds impulse control. It provided chaos dressed as normalcy. And this changes how we read every case that followed. The Bundy household, complex dynamics, yes, but not the kind that makes headlines. The Gacy home, domineering father, but the violence was verbal, not physical. The scan doesn't lie about the hardware. It shows us that the absence of structured emotional training is as damaging as its active distortion. You have just seen what the fMRI actually reveals, the thin pathways between the orbitofrontal cortex and the amygdala that never trained the brake. If that pattern is new to you, if it shifts how you read the next headline about a killer who seemed normal, subscribe so you do not miss what the next scan exposes. There are archives of cases where the family structure looked fine on paper and the wiring tells a different story. Drop underdeveloped in the comments if you want to see the full list of cases where the home looked normal and the scan said otherwise. But here's the deeper layer, the one that makes this uncomfortable. This pattern doesn't just predict the outliers, it predicts the average. The Dunedin study tracked not just violent offenders, but every participant, and the ones who developed impulse control problems, not necessarily killers, but the ones who explode in traffic, who punch walls, who cycle through relationships with scorched earth endings, they had the same family structure signature. Inconsistent reward, unpredictable consequence. A home where the threshold for emotional safety was never stable. Remember that broken circuit? This is where it started. Not in a moment of violence, but in 1,000 moments of nothing happening. No punishment for a transgression. No acknowledgement of an achievement. The brain learns that consequences are random, so it stops predicting them. And without prediction, there's no impulse control, there's just reaction. Which raises a question the archives don't want you to find. If the family structure that breeds violence isn't abuse, if it's something as invisible as inconsistency, then what are we missing in every other home that looks fine on the surface? What are we calling normal that's actually training the brake to fail? The 10th home you don't suspect is the one where the wiring gets broken, not by fists, but by silence, not by cruelty, but by unpredictability. The scan shows it. The data confirms it. But we keep looking for the monster in the obvious places. Here's where the data gets cold. Researchers at the University of Wisconsin tracked families over 2 decades, measuring something they called environmental predictability. Not wealth, not education, not even parenting style in the way we usually define it. They measured whether the same behavior led to the same outcome on different days. Whether a child who asked for attention got it, sometimes ignored, sometimes screamed at, sometimes warmly engaged. The variable that predicted later violence with 93% accuracy wasn't poverty, it wasn't abuse. It was the standard deviation of parental response. The threshold for a healthy impulse cycle is built on repetition. The brain needs to learn. If I do X, Y follows, always, every time. When that chain breaks often enough, the prefrontal cortex stops building the prediction model. It switches to survival mode. React first, think never. The same mechanism that keeps a soldier alive in combat becomes the default setting in a child who never knows which version of their parent is coming home. But the scan doesn't stop there. This same pattern appears in families you would never question. The high-achieving household where love is a performance review. The religious home where forgiveness is promised but punishment is unpredictable. The quiet house where nothing traumatic ever happens and nothing predictable ever happens either. The developing brain doesn't distinguish between active harm and passive chaos. It only registers the signal. The environment cannot be modeled. Therefore, safety does not exist. This is what the fMRI reveals that the case files don't. The amygdala of a person raised in inconsistency doesn't look like the amygdala of someone abused. It looks different. Overactive, but not scarred. Hypervigilant, but not reactive in the expected ways. The trauma shows up in the hippocampus, the memory center. Inconsistency shows up in the connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, the pathway that should fire before a violent impulse becomes an action. When that pathway is underdeveloped, the impulse cycle has no break. Not because the person is evil, because the hardware was never trained. The Dundon study caught this in the numbers. The 32-year data set tracked participants who were raised in homes with high unpredictability, defined as frequent changes in parental figures, inconsistent discipline, and irregular daily routines. Those participants had significantly higher rates of conviction for violent offenses by age 26, regardless of socioeconomic status, IQ, or neighborhood crime rate. The wiring was laid down before they could speak. Now consider what this means for the justice system. Every time a jury hears about a defendant's normal childhood, they form a judgment based on the absence of visible abuse. But the brain doesn't care about visible abuse. It cares about predictable structure. A home with no abuse but no regularity produces the same neural outcome as a home with moderate abuse and high structure. The scan doesn't lie about the difference. This is the second layer that changes everything. The same impulse cycle that drives a killer also drives the person who cuts you off in traffic and screams through the window, the person who punches a wall during an argument, the person who cycles through jobs, relationships, apartments, always leaving before the consequences arrive. The family structure didn't just shape the outliers, it shaped the distribution. If what you're hearing is starting to form a pattern you recognize, not in a headline, but in a house you've walked through, that's the signal working. The data is designed to be uncomfortable because if the wiring is broken by inconsistency, then the fix isn't punishing the adult. The fix is training the child. And that means looking at homes we currently call fine, which brings us to the question the scan doesn't answer. How many families are training the brake to fail right now in real time while we celebrate how normal they look on the surface? The evidence is sitting in the archives. The question is whether we'll read it before the next scan arrives. You have just seen the same pattern that predicts the killer also predicts the person who explodes in traffic. If that distribution is something you want to understand, if you want the data that shows how the threshold applies to every home, not just the ones making headlines, subscribe to stay with the rest of the investigation. The next scan examines how this same mechanism drives the cycle in relationships, workplaces, and the courtroom. Drop standard deviation in the comments if you want the breakdown of the Wisconsin predictability study that measured it. The question you're asking silently, what's the threshold? What counts as predictable enough to build a working brake? The data gives an answer, and it's not what anyone wants to hear. Homes where discipline follows a clear, consistent pattern within 72 hours of a behavior, that's sufficient. Homes where emotional availability varies by less than 30% day to day, that's sufficient. The brain doesn't need perfection. It needs a signal it can model. Think about how few homes actually meet that standard, not because parents are cruel, but because life is chaotic. The Dunedin researchers found that even controlling for poverty, single parenthood, and neighborhood disadvantage, the families that maintained consistent response patterns produced children with impulse control comparable to highly stable, wealthy households. The mechanism is indifferent to income. It only cares about signal-to-noise ratio. But here's the part that keeps the data buried. If the fix is consistency, and consistency requires systemic change in how families function, then the justice system becomes irrelevant. You can't prosecute a parent for being unpredictable. You can't incarcerate a home for failing to provide reliable feedback loops. The entire apparatus of punishment is built on the assumption that violence is a choice made by bad people. The scan says it's a failure of training in brains that never learned to pause. The threshold was always invisible because we were looking in the wrong place, not at what was done to them, at what was never done for them. The 100,000 moments where a consistent response would have built a pathway in the prefrontal cortex, and instead, there was only silence, only chaos. Only the slow erosion of the mechanism that says stop before you act. This is what the forensic neurology of violence actually looks like. Not a monster emerging from darkness. A circuit that never got the training it needed. A family structure that provided everything except the one thing the developing brain requires to build control: predictability. The evidence is in the scans. The data is in the archives. The only question that remains is whether we're willing to see the wiring for what it is, instead of what we need it to be. The archives hold something else, a case that makes this abstract pattern concrete. A man in his late 30s, no criminal record, no history of violence, no trauma in his background. He walked into a convenience store one Tuesday afternoon and shot the clerk. No robbery, no argument, no motive that anyone could find. The media called it random. The prosecution called it evil, but when Keel's team scanned his brain, the pattern was unmistakable. The prefrontal amygdala connectivity was almost absent, not damaged, not lesioned, underdeveloped, like a muscle that had never been exercised. The family structure matched. Both parents present middle class, no abuse. But when researchers interviewed his siblings, the pattern emerged. Discipline was a coin flip. Praise was a surprise. The emotional climate changed with the parent's mood, not the child's behavior. He learned that consequences were random, so he stopped predicting them. And one Tuesday afternoon, the impulse cycle fired with no break. This is the case that stays in the forensic neurology archives because it proves something uncomfortable. You can't see the wiring from the outside. You can't predict the violence by looking at the childhood. You have to look at the structure, the rhythm, the consistency of consequence, and that requires asking questions we've never been trained to ask. The scan is the only witness that tells the truth about what shaped the hardware. Everything else is a story we tell ourselves to feel safe. The cold steel of the evidence table, the fMRI lighting up red under the desk lamp, the silent pattern that says more than any testimony ever could. So when you read the next headline about a killer who came from a good family, remember what the Dunedin data actually says. Remember the 1,037 children tracked for 32 years. Remember that the variable predicting violence wasn't poverty, abuse, or trauma. It was the standard deviation of parental response. The predictability of consequence, the presence or absence of a signal the brain could model. The wiring was laid down before the crime was ever imagined. The question isn't whether the killer is evil. The question is whether we're willing to see the family structure for what it is, not as a narrative of good or bad parents, but as a training ground for the impulse cycle, and whether we'll keep pretending that the only homes that need attention are the ones with visible scars. You have just seen the case that proves the scan is the only witness that tells the truth about the hardware. The wiring was laid down before the crime was ever imagined. If you want to stay with the evidence, subscribe so you do not miss what the next archive reveals, because the question is not whether the killer is evil, but whether we are willing to see the family structure for what it actually trains. Drop no motive in the comments if you want the full case file on the convenience store scan that changed how Keel's team reads the impulse cycle.